Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Technology and Domestic Abuse, Awareness and Empowerment. I hope you and your family are well and are keeping safe. I'm Ranjan Sinha. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of Narika. This webinar is being hosted by Narika in partnership with the National Network to End Domestic Violence and sponsored by Tavant. The webinar series brings together experts that are working in the intersection of technology and domestic abuse. Narika is very excited to present this ongoing technology abuse webinar series to raise awareness and empower survivors and solution seekers. Narika was founded in 1992 to serve survivors of domestic violence and relationship abuse. It offers free counseling services, support groups, job training programs, and wellness programs for our community. During the pandemic, Narika witnessed a spike in cases of domestic violence and other forms of control like immigration and financial abuse. Now, domestic abuse is a major public health problem affecting millions of people in the United States alone each year. It has become so widespread globally that the United Nations Secretary General has called for measures to address the global surge in domestic violence. The same technologies that safeguard us, ease our routines, and enrich our experiences are also being manipulated by abusers to exert control over their victims. This is leading to the introduction of policies on how we design our products to be both privacy and safety aware, as well as developing solutions, some of which we will cover in today's session. So before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping tips for this webinar. So today's webinar is being recorded. We will upload excerpts of the webinar and provide a YouTube link. Please enter questions for the speakers and panelists in the Q&A chat box. This will be answered during the Q&A sessions. For any other comments, please use the webinar chat. We have a few volunteers who are monitoring this chat. Closed captioning has been enabled. And if there are any webinar service outages, please do join back in a couple of minutes. For those of you just joining us, welcome to this webinar. Today's keynote speakers are Molly Dragiewicz from Griffith University, Australia, and Lesley Nuttall from IBM, UK. They're working in the intersection of technology and domestic abuse. This will be followed by a panel discussion with Eva Galperin from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Corbin Streett from NNEDV, Diana Freed from Cornell Tech, Molly Dragiewicz from Griffith University, and Bindu Oomen Fernandes from Narika, who will share their experiences and work in this field. Now, Corbin Streett is representing our partner, NNEDV, at this webinar today. She's a technology safety specialist at NNEDV's Safety Net project and has worked in the field for over 12 years. On behalf of Narika, I extend our sincere gratitude and appreciation to Tavant for sponsoring this webinar. Tavant is a digital products and solutions company that provides impactful results across a wide range of industries. It is a global company headquartered in Santa Clara, California, with almost 3,000 employees. Tavant is recognized as a top employer and a tech leader. From powering how you shop for a home, to how you bank, to how you get a mortgage, to how you pay on your iPhone, to how you stream, Tavant touches many parts of your day. Innovation using artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms is core to its mission. Tavant, thanks once again for your support to this cause. As Corbin is preparing to speak, I'd like you to answer two quick poll questions. So, Corbin, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today to join you again. I wanted to take just a minute to talk a little bit about the work that we do at the Safety Net project at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and then I'll introduce our first speaker. So my name is Corbin Streett, and I'm a technology safety specialist at Safety Net. And at SafetyNet, we train and provide technical assistance to organizations across the country who are working in their communities to help victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and trafficking. And a few of our areas of expertise include how technology is being misused against victims, how survivors can harness technology safely, how survivors can safely relocate and keep their information private in this world that we live in, where there's so much information online, and what organizations can do to keep victim information confidential when they're using technology to do their work. And technology is a powerful tool. I don't have to tell you all that. You're here, you know that. And the misuse of it can cause grave harm to survivors. It's used to take control over victims, to cause them harm, to embarrass them, to alienate them from their friends and family. But, and this is a really important part, it's also an incredibly vital tool that survivors have a right to. The answer to tech misuse and misuse is to tech abuse and misuse is not to tell survivors to get offline or to get rid of their devices. Those could be two options. Those could be options that a survivor wants to choose, right? But that shouldn't be the only option that we offer, and we shouldn't put it on them to be the ones who have to get offline. Technology connects survivors to safety. It connects them to community, to a sense of well-being, to education, to economic opportunities, and that's really the most important part of our work is helping ensure survivors have the tools to be able to stay safe online, and that ensure that their privacy will be protected when they are online. Um, Again, I'm delighted to be here today, and that Narika is prioritizing this issue. And with no further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Molly Dragiewicz is Associate Professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University in Australia. She's an internationally award-winning criminologist who studies violence and gender. And she's currently working on research about technology-facilitated coercive control and domestic violence in the context of post-separation parenting. She founded Australia's first interdisciplinary graduate certificate in domestic violence and also created and convenes the Brisbane Domestic Violence Research Student Network. So Molly, I will now pass it to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully you can hear and or see me. I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen. And now, hopefully you can see my slides up there. If you could let me know if that's not happening, that would be great. I'd just like to say hello to everyone. I see Australia representing in the chat box, so yay, Australia. Thank you so much for taking the time to come along today. I know that every one of us is super overworked and overextended, so I really appreciate you taking the time, especially those of you that are over on the East Coast where it's after work hours. I really appreciate being invited to speak during work time for me, daytime, which is very fabulous. Thank you so much to Narika for organizing the series with NNEDV. I am a giant fangirl for domestic violence organizations of all kinds and a huge fan of the SafetyNet project and the Australian version of that, which is run through an organization called WestNet. As Corbin said, I'm Molly Dragiewicz, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the ways that children are involved in technology-facilitated coercive control. So I'd first like to get started by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians of the lands where I'm located on Yugambeh country, the Kumbameri people. I pay my respects to the Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, here and where everyone is listening from today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty for this land has never been ceded, and so it always was and always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. So the research that I'll be talking about today is based on a study that was commissioned by the Australian government via eSafety. And the A-Safety Research Program collects data to provide an evidence base to develop resources and programs related to online safety. And this includes things like self-help tools and toolkits and training for professionals. So for this project, I worked with a wonderful team that included Patrick O'Leary, Jeff Ackerman, Ernest Fu, Chris Bond, Amy Young, and Claire Reed, all of whom are from Griffith. So the study that I'll be talking about today, I only have a little short piece of time to talk about this giant piece of research, but the study involved a mixed methods study of a whole bunch of different people. We did a survey of professionals who work with domestic violence cases. We did focus groups with domestic violence specialist service staff who work with children. We did interviews with mothers who are survivors of domestic and family violence. We also did just a handful of interviews with young people who've been affected by technology-facilitated abuse in the context of domestic and family violence. And we also did interviews with fathers in behavior change programs. So quite a giant piece of work to talk about in 15 minutes. So what exactly is technology-facilitated coercive control? Well, that's a giant jargon, isn't it? So coercive control is currently becoming a very popular term here in Australia for describing the social problem that we understand as domestic violence, usually in the US, or domestic and family violence here in Australia. Coercive control is a constellation of abusive behaviors that can include violence, intimidation, isolation, and control. And the way that it's being talked about in Australia, people are really starting to catch on to this idea that it's a constellation of behaviors that includes non-physical as well as physical types of abuse. But one of the core components of coercive control is the structural inequality bit. So coercive control leverages structural inequality to establish the micromanagement of gendered activities, such as parenting and housework, in the context of mainstream cultural norms. And this is backed up by institutions that are profoundly shaped by multiple intersecting forms of inequality. So this study that we did that I'm talking about today was primarily interested in the ways that children are involved in abuse by adult intimate partners. So it was looking at that adult abusive relationship and the way that children were brought into that. There's a whole array of different types of technology facilitated abuse that involve children, and they have somewhat different dynamics, so they all deserve their own attention and research. So we found that children experience forms of abuse such as monitoring via social media, stalking using GPS, fathers grilling children for information about their location or their mother's activities via FaceTime, verbal abuse and threats over the phone, repetitive, intrusive texting and calling, impersonation of the child or another person, and blocking communication with the non-abusive parent. So those are just some of the behaviors that we found in our study. So I only have time to highlight just a few key findings today. But in a nutshell, we found that children were very highly involved in technology-facilitated coercive control. Perpetrators directly abused children, and they also involved children in technology-facilitated abuse directed primarily at their mothers. Post-separation co-parenting was a really key context for this abuse. And this isn't surprising since we know that domestic violence rarely ends at separation and commonly escalates at that time. Despite concerns about purpose-built spyware that are seem to be cropping up now that we're training domestic violence advocates about technology-facilitated abuse, most of the abuse involved common technologies, and in our study, offenders with quite low levels of technological sophistication. We documented the ways that technology-facilitated abuse harms children, despite its non-physical nature. And finally, I always just really like to stress this point that I have stolen wholeheartedly from the Northwest Network to End Violence and Abuse. And that's that identical behaviors, devices, and applications can be used to abuse or protect. And this gets to Corbin's point about technology being a powerful resource for survivors that we cannot take away from them. So our survey documented professionals' awareness of children's significant involvements in technology-facilitated coercive control. Overall, the professionals estimated that about 27% of their domestic violence cases involve technology-facilitated abuse of children. This average, though, obscures a whole lot of variation across the professions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, child safety and youth workers, whose attention is focused on children and are often speaking directly to them, made the highest estimates. And they estimated that up to 48% of their domestic violence caseload involved technology-facilitated abuse and children. Corrections, police, and services tailored for culturally and linguistically diverse and immigrant communities made the lowest estimates, starting at about 8%. And we imagine that this has a lot to do with the nature of the work that these agencies and organizations are doing. So the survey results provide really preliminary information about the behaviors professionals are most aware of. But just as importantly, they show how many different types of abuse professionals said they wouldn't know about, in part because we don't systematically ask about tech abuse. And we also, here in Australia, don't have a strong tradition of eliciting children's voices, even in matters that affect them greatly. So monitoring and stalking, threats and intimidation, and blocking communication were the most common types of abuse according to the professionals who completed our survey. And if you look at the report, this is broken down into a large number of very specific types of abuse. So hopefully you can all check that out later. But I would just want to talk about a couple of examples that really illustrate the dynamics that we're talking about. So for example, Abby, one of the young people that we interviewed, gave this example about impersonation. And she said, "He logged into my messenger on Facebook. I don't know how he did it. He guessed my password. I don't know, somehow just got into it and messaged all my friends and read all of it. And yeah, that's the only thing he's done like that. And found out where I was by reading all my messages and stuff. I don't know. He hasn't actually tracked me from his phone. He stupidly messaged my boyfriend when I was with my boyfriend. We were just watching a movie. None of us were on our phones, and his phone went ding, and it's all these abusive messages from me. And he's like, oh, look at this. And I got onto it pretty quickly from there." So this is an example where Abby talks about a case where her father was impersonating her to interfere with her supportive relationships. And this gets at one of those key aspects of coercive control, that isolation. Just one more example. One of the professionals described an example of an abuser using a child in order to abuse his mother. And they wrote in the open-ended section of the survey, "The child had access to gaming, and so did the father. The father pretended to be a young boy. The child assumed he was playing a game against his friend. Dad used the gaming time as a space to ask the child questions, to find out when mom was going to be alone in the house. The child thought all was innocent and answered. Dad got the info. When mom was alone, he went over to her house, beat her up, and left her very wounded." So this is another example of the same type of abuse, impersonation, but it shows how that can leak over into offline actual physical violence as well. So one of the interesting paradoxes of this research is that post-separation contact between abusers and children and between the parents around parenting really enabled ongoing abuse. So technology-facilitated contact was used in lieu of physical meetings to decrease risk, yet instead it enables really persistent harm. So this technology-facilitated abuse had significant impacts on children. Now, sometimes in a lot of professions, people still seem to make assumptions that technology-facilitated abuse isn't really that bad, or it's not really harmful since it's not physical violence. However, our survey indicates that professionals recognize that children experienced a wide range of harms from this abuse. So they estimated that out of the children in the cases that they were aware of, 67% experienced mental health issues, 63% would experience fear, and 59% might experience feelings of guilt for disclosing information to the offending parent, and another 59% thought there were negative impacts on the relationship with the non-abusive parent. So contrary to the sort of mainstream cybersecurity models that are really concerned with these sophisticated actors, the technologies involved in the abuse that we learned about in this study were really the most common mainstream everyday devices. So most of the abuse reported involved the misuse of really common devices, services, and functions that have a legitimate dual use. Most cases involved the misuse of mainstream technologies rather than purpose-built spyware. For example, commercially available devices such as smartphones, iPads, smartwatches, and gaming consoles have legitimate uses, but can be misused by perpetrators. Perpetrators in this study also abuse services such as cloud-based storage, cross-device message syncing, and Find My Device applications. So one of the points I really like to emphasize is that identical devices, applications, and behaviors are used to abuse and protect. So this means that specific technologies or even tech behaviors aren't the problem. Context really is everything when it comes to domestic violence. So we need new cybersecurity models tailored to the interpersonal, intimate, and family context to deal with these problems. And if you haven't seen Perry Dorfler's presentation that's cited there and listed in the reference on something you have and something you know, that's a really great entry point into this discussion. This type of technology-facilitated abuse demands new types of collaboration between professional survivors, academics, designers, and governments to respond and ultimately prevent abuse. But technology can't fix the domestic violence or coercive control problem. We also still have to have the difficult conversations about the underlying causes of abuse, which are deeply embedded in our cultures. So where do we go from here? Well, tech-facilitated coercive control is a really complex problem, and we are literally just beginning to study it. This type of abuse demands collaboration between professionals, survivors, academics, everyone else. And as a domestic violence researcher, I'm actively letting you know that I am seeking collaboration with others to continue this work with people who have a different skill set than I possess. And I really look forward to talking about any of these issues in more detail in the Q&A. And that's it from me.
So Molly, thank you for sharing the work you have been doing in this space. There is one question for you in the chat, Q&A chat box.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to read it out loud to you if that would be helpful.
Yes, please,
Sure.
because
sometimes this is tricky.
Yeah.
The navigating, talking and presenting while also trying to figure out the tech. Okay, so the first question, Molly, can you tell us more about difficulties in having children's own voices more represented in research on DFV? Their views are under-researched, but there are challenges and risks in involving children in research. How can we work to overcome this?
This is a really fantastic question. There is more of a cultural shift around including children's voices directly. A lot of that is coming from Scandinavia and a bit from the UK, where they've just launched, I think Scotland has recently launched the first Barnhuus, which is a service specifically to deal with children's trauma, which is a new service model. And other countries have built into their laws as part of honoring human rights tools and obligations that the countries have signed on to that actually require including and soliciting children's voices in matters that affect them, including things like family law decisions in the context of domestic violence. We really do not have that ethos in Australia. However, there is a shift that seems to be happening in the research where people are being encouraged, and I guess our ethics boards at the universities are more open now to allowing us to speak to children, which can be, depending on the university that you work at, can be really difficult. Some of the challenges associated with speaking to children, especially young children in the context of domestic violence, is those children are rarely able to actually be safe and separate from their abusive parent. The most common situation is for the abuser to have some sort of shared custody or at least access and contact to that child. And so they really can't heal. So those children are deeply traumatized, which is not great for research purposes. To be very crass and direct about that, it's difficult to get coherent narratives out of traumatized people. And it's also, there's questions to do with safety. So one of the things that needs to happen is there needs to be a cultural shift where we value and listen to children's voices, but also the funding agencies. This study was a very short-term study, so we didn't have time. Doing research with children takes a very long time. It takes longer to get in. It takes longer to build rapport. And it simply is something that the funding models don't necessarily support right now. So there's a number of challenges there. But I always recommend that advisors, researchers collaborate with service organizations so that any survivors they're doing research with are properly supported, and that also includes children.
Great, thank you. And we had a couple more come in as you were answering that one. One person was asking where they could find the report from the study, and maybe we could put that in the chat.
I can just paste that link in for you.
Great. And then another person said, "Thank you. This is really interesting. What kind of methodological approaches did you use to include young adults' voices to ensure that they're able to tell stories fully when parents are also available in the same room? And do you have any suggestions for creating new tech perspective?"
We only spoke to 4 young people, and I call them young people because they're not really children. The young people that we spoke to were 16 to 18 years old. And so the researchers on this team, it was Patrick O'Leary and Amy Young that interviewed the children, and they did it at school. So ideally, you would not interview children with a parent in the room. That might be different if it's a very young child, but it's really nice to be able to collaborate with schools or services to get space to get that access to children. But yeah, you're not going to have a safe situation or a comfortable situation if the parent's in the room. So with this type of research in particular, talking to young people who are not necessarily living with the abuser anymore, or who have a bit more freedom to get to school and talk to you on their own, can be a really valuable source of information, even though they're not young children anymore.
Yes, absolutely. And then one final question came in. What is working to get action or safe practices in family law to manage the well-being of children?
We are not there yet. We are not there yet by a long shot. There continues to be a huge disconnect between what we know from the research on domestic and family violence, what we know about the impact of trauma on children that are exposed to domestic and family violence, the centrality of children to the dynamics of coercive control in adult domestic violence, and what happens in family law. In Australia and a lot of other countries, there continues to be a culture, if not written into the laws, a pro-contact culture that values both parents' access to the child over safety. And so until that culture change happens, it's really impossible. It makes it very difficult to protect children because they are forced into ongoing contact. And the young people that we interviewed said that they wanted to be in control of whether or what communication they had with their abusive parent. So this is an area where there's a lot of a lot of room to improve and a lot of room to grow.
Thank you so much. One other question did come up, but I think we need to, just to make sure we give everybody time to speak. I'm wondering, Molly, if you could look in the Q&A and maybe type that answer to that remaining question, and I'll move forward and introduce our next speaker. And thank you so much again for all the amazing work you're doing and for sharing that here with us today. Next up, we have Lesley Nuttall, who works with IBM within IBM Security Expert Labs. And at IBM, she is working to minimize the risks. I apologize. The risks of tech enabling domestic abuse, and has devised a set of design principles to guide other device and software makers, which was released as a policy paper on 5 technology design principles to combat domestic abuse in 2020. She works closely with customers from a range of industries, offering technical guidance and advice. And Lesley's career has always had a technical focus, but at its core is helping others. And Lesley, I will pass it to you now.
Hello, my name is Lesley Nuttall. I'm here today to talk about an IBM initiative focused on determining how we can make technology resistant to being used as a weapon in abusive relationships. On that note, I just want to give a quick content warning. While there are no graphic descriptions of violence, we will be discussing aspects of domestic abuse which some people may find upsetting. Technology has revolutionized our world, making our lives easier, safer, faster, and more connected. It allows us to video chat with a loved one halfway around the world, instantly make purchases for everything from groceries to houses, and remotely control home devices to ensure comfort and security. But imagine being terrified of that technology, being fearful to leave the home, afraid to connect with friends, and scared that if you do not follow every single rule, the all-seeing devices in your home will know, and so will your abuser. This isn't some fictional dystopian tale, but instead a daily reality for a multitude of domestic abuse victims. It's a sad fact that domestic abuse is a pervasive problem in society, and anyone of any age, gender, race, or religion can be a victim or a perpetrator. In recent months, COVID-19 has only made things worse, with the UN estimating a 20% increase in domestic abuse cases worldwide, and abusers are leveraging technology to facilitate this abuse. To help tackle the issue, IBM published our 5 design principles to combat domestic abuse, which we hope will be the first step on the path towards inherently safer technology. The idea for these principles came about after some colleagues were openly laughing and discussing about how they were remotely controlling the heating and Wi-Fi at home, unbeknownst to their partners who were at home at the time. Now, this was all said in a very jovial manner as a practical joke, and it's very possible that their partners also found it funny. But it got us wondering if and how everyday technology could be used in a more sinister setting. So a team of IBM volunteers set up an initiative to investigate. After some initial research, it soon became clear that this kind of manipulation of technology is prevalent in domestic abuse, particularly coercive control, where relentless patterns of coercive and controlling behaviors create such fear of another person that the victim will do anything the abuser requires. There is help and guidance available to people facing this kind of abuse, but the bulk of it focuses on keeping safe by educating yourself in the technology. In addition, Advice could sometimes further isolate victims, and apps built to help could place them in increased danger if discovered by the perpetrator. We believe that the burden of safety shouldn't fall solely on the shoulders of the end user. That is why we felt that it was important that at least some of the onus be shifted onto thoughtful design, and thus we developed a set of guidelines that helps technologists think about building their products from the ground up to be resistant to abuse. So, how is technology being used to abuse? Meet Tina, a stay-at-home mum with 2 children who has recently split up from her partner. This morning, when she came down for breakfast, her smart speakers started playing threatening, expletive-filled tirades. This has happened before and is starting to really upset Tina. Her ex-partner set them up, and Tina can't work out how to remove his control. She thinks she'll probably have to throw the speakers away. After taking the children to school, Tina heads to a new cafe she found online. While waiting for her friend, Tina's ex-partner turns up unexpectedly and causes an awful scene. She has no idea how he found her, but he's been monitoring Tina's search history via her cloud accounts and tracking her location with the car app. The friend she was meant to meet never turns up, and when Tina calls, her friend says that she received a message from Tina the night before on social media, cancelling the date. Tina's ex still has access to her account on his phone and deleted the message after sending it, so Tina couldn't see it in her history. To top it off, Tina then receives a notification from her banking app with details of a new incoming transaction. She discovers that her ex-partner has transferred a few pennies to her account with a vile message in the transaction description. Tina goes home feeling depressed, isolated, and scared. How is her ex-partner still controlling her even after she made him leave? Tina is a victim of technology-facilitated abuse, and she is not alone. An Australian survey of domestic violence support workers found an almost complete overlap between technology abuse and domestic abuse, with 98% saying they had clients who had experienced technology-facilitated abuse. The victims feel like they're under constant surveillance. They feel vulnerable, powerless, and they feel like nowhere is safe. At this point, you might be wondering, how big of a problem is this? Are we talking about a niche issue? Whilst there is no central reporting for technology-facilitated abuse, the number of cases appear to be on the rise. You may have seen the various news articles talking about survivors' experiences, many of which are quite disturbing. In fact, a UK news investigation looking into technology abuse found an 1,800% increase in alleged cyberstalking offences between 2014 and 18. In addition, cybersecurity company Kaspersky reported that stalkerware infections grew by 40% in 2019. Refuge, the UK's largest provider of shelters for domestic abuse victims, who also run the National Helpline, found that nearly 3/4 of the people seeking their help last year had faced abuse via technology. In the past 2 years, the charity has also seen a rise in cases which involve abusers using IoT devices against their victims, such as smart locks, webcams, and smart heating systems. It's very, very possible that such cases are underreported because many victims may be simply unaware of what is happening to them. Considering all this, I think we are safe to say that technology-facilitated abuse is a significant issue. It's been estimated that 1 in 5 people experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. For women, this rises to nearly 1 in 3. But what is deeply worrying is the impact on children. In the UK, 1 in 7 children and young people under the age of 18 will have lived with domestic violence at some point in their childhood. And a recent study, commissioned by eSafety in Australia, found that 27% of domestic abuse cases involve technology-facilitated abuse of children. The perpetrators typically use everyday technologies to cause harm, with the most common categories of abuse being monitoring and stalking, threats and intimidation, as well as blocking communications. In one case, a man pretended to be his son's friend on a computer game in a desperate attempt to determine the boy's mother's location so that he could physically assault her. The children feel a sense of being continuously watched, guilt for inadvertently disclosing information, as well as fear for the consequences. Professionals reported this contributed to harmful impacts on the mental health of over 2/3 of the children, with serious impacts including depression, suicidal thoughts, school absenteeism, and social isolation. In the words of the eSafety Commissioner, the perpetrating parent makes the children a pawn in the technology-facilitated abuse of the other parent, and this causes real harm to the child's mental health, to their relationship with a non-abusive parent, and to their everyday activities. Unfortunately, there is no easy answer to ending technology-facilitated abuse. However, we can help by balancing the intended with the unintended consequences of our tech, and IBM's 5 design principles will guide technologists in this endeavour. The first principle is promoting diversity, having a diverse design team who consider all potential users of the technology, allowing greater exploration of both positive and negative use cases. Second is guaranteeing privacy and choice by enabling users to make active, informed decisions about their privacy settings with simple and clear configuration where the default settings are carefully considered. The third principle is combating gaslighting by having a digital record of who did what when, so as to disrupt attempts at psychological manipulation. Fourth is strengthening security in data so that users of technology have joint control, with the tech only collecting and sharing necessary data. The final principle is making technology more intuitive so that users can navigate and understand it with ease, thus reducing the risk of abusers dominating with their greater technical confidence. To bring context to these principles, I'll now explore some scenarios with you. While the examples themselves are fictional, they draw on our research to ensure that they are realistic. This is Stacey. Her mum Mary has escaped her abusive husband Dave to a refuge with Stacey and her younger brother Toby. When Stacey's dad messages her asking for a photo of her homework, Stacey doesn't think anything of it and sends it to her dad. Stacey doesn't realise the photo has location data embedded in it. Dave uses this to find the refuge and waits outside to threaten Mary. Terrified, Mary has to scramble to find somewhere new she can safely stay with her children. The creators of the photo sharing app used personas to discover use cases, but the personas didn't include children. The team, therefore, didn't come to appreciate that children would not understand the terminology used in their privacy conditions. This led to Stacey sharing her location data unknowingly, which is then used by Dave with harmful consequences. Designers of technology can broaden their understanding of how their tech might be used by looking at a range of user profiles, exploring both the happy and the unhappy paths. As well as including children as potential users of the application, the developers could also have included an abusive persona to explore ways that their products might be manipulated for harm. when looking at these usage scenarios, it's important to consider the impact of a situation happening as well as the probability of it taking place. A rare stress case may be worth developing if it has devastating consequences. Technology design is critical to solving challenges at the product and experience level, yet our devices and apps tend to reflect the people who create them. Therefore, we need to ensure that the rich variance in humanity is reflected in our design teams. Having a diverse range of voices being heard throughout the development process would not only enable a more complete set of requirements and use cases be identified, but also help to determine potential issues from an individual, societal, and ethical perspective. Alex here is setting his social media privacy settings. The choices are a big green Accept Default button and a smaller red Advanced Settings button. Alex chooses the Accept Default option as it's easier and less intimidating. Later that day, he accepts a friend request from a female acquaintance and, based on his default settings, this is unknowingly posted to his profile page. Alex's abusive wife sees this update and decides to punish him. In this example, Alex was guided to accept the default as the custom privacy settings were less appealing. However, he did not fully understand the consequences of that choice. If he had known that the default option would automatically post all activities to his page, he might have made a different decision. The technology we use needs to be transparent and proactively inform us about what data is shared and recorded, so that we can make decisions that are right and safe for us. In addition, the most appropriate privacy settings might differ across the user base or change with time. So rather than having just one set of default settings, it might be worth exploring different approaches. This is Rob. He's at home a lot while his partner Angus goes to work. Strange things have been happening over the last few weeks. Lights randomly turning off when he's trying to read, the stereo blasting out loud music when he's on a call, and the temperature alternating between stifling heat and frigid cold. This is a continuous pattern, and Rob feels like he's losing control of his home. Yet, when he tries to discuss this with his partner, Angus dismisses his worries, responding with, "You're overreacting, and that's never happened to me. You must be imagining it." The reality is that Angus is controlling the home remotely, and with no clear indication on the devices as to what changes have been made, Rob is left in the dark. Gaslighting is where a person manipulates someone psychologically into doubting their memories and judgment. Technology can play a key part in this, especially when it can be controlled by more than one user or accessed remotely. If the devices in our homes had obvious alerts when they are remotely activated and had an audit trail of changes, this would make it difficult for abusers to obscure and distort the truth. This is Lynn. She was initially reluctant to share her email password with Roger, but he insisted, saying it was important to have trust when you're in a relationship. Now Roger can access many of Lynn's accounts that are linked to that email address. Lynn does not know that her navigation app is saving a history of everywhere she goes. This is linked to her email account, so Roger now has access to this too. The dynamic in personal relationships is different to the standard one user, one account scenario. Accounts and passwords are often shared, or devices in the home have multiple users with only one account. With the increase in the use of federated accounts to log into multiple sites, abusers could have access to data from multiple sources with just one password. If Lynn's apps had encouraged her to enable two-factor authentication, Roger would have had an additional barrier. It would be harder for him to access all of Lynn's accounts without her knowing, even though he has her password. However, even here we face challenges. Some devices have their notification settings default to show content on the lock screen. So, if Lynn had not changed her phone's default settings, a one-time password would be shown on her phone, which Roger could see without the need to log in. One final area to mention here is data. Being aware that it can have different sensitivities and making sure you consider how it could be manipulated in the wrong hands. Take the example of device battery levels, which is often included when you share your location. This seems like a minor, innocuous piece of data, and you might wonder what harm there is in sharing it. But with that small piece of information in the hands of an abuser, their victim can no longer escape the relentless barrage of abusive messages by turning off their phone and saying their battery had died, because the perpetrator will know they lied, potentially leading to harmful consequences. Olivia here is on maternity leave, spending a lot of time at home caring for her newborn son. Her controlling father has recently installed a connected doorbell. Olivia doesn't know how the doorbell works. She isn't sure if it's recording all the time, so she's nervous about leaving the house or having her friends come to visit without her father's permission. The doorbell requires an application be installed on a device. If it is complicated to set up and use, or even if it is perceived to be so, it could be a barrier to Olivia controlling her own environment. For those without a confident grasp of a given piece of technology, it's easy to fear its potential in the hands of someone else. Making technology intuitive to use and understand is key. Even minor changes such as wording could make a difference, meaning a less confident user is more likely to access functionality that aids them. However, it's worth noting that intuitive does not mean obvious. Often, a designer's goal is to mask complexity and create something whose logic makes sense, operates consistently, and is transferable, providing enough confidence to encourage exploration. Consider the swiping and multi-finger gestures on smartphones. These aren't immediately obvious, but once a user learns these options exist, most will quickly begin experimenting to see whether they work in new contexts. User experience is a complex task, so it's important to not only have diverse design teams, but also that thorough usability testing has been carried out to a range of users, as what may seem intuitive to one may not be intuitive to all. To recap, the 5 design principles are promoting diversity, guaranteeing privacy and choice, combating gaslighting, strengthening security in data, and making technology more intuitive. Some may be more related to user interfaces, some are focused on server-side functionality, while still others are concerned with cybersecurity methods. But at the end of the day, any technology that interacts with humans, uses their data, or influences decisions about and for them could potentially be manipulated by bad actors. That is why we ask that anyone developing new technology adopt these principles, open up conversations, and start asking the questions as to whether their technology could be used to cause harm. In addition to the obvious morality behind designing products in this way, such an approach will also have wider benefits. It's been seen before that creating technology to be more inclusive can have a positive impact on the whole. Take the example of subtitles on videos, which were originally developed for people with hearing impairments. They turned out to be really useful in a wide variety of situations, such as in very noisy or very quiet environments, and for translating spoken content into different languages. By thinking about technology-facilitated abuse and designing products to resist it, we should be able to enhance the usability, security, and privacy of new technologies for all. Domestic abuse is a scourge on our families and communities, with technology enabling this hidden crime. While the control that abusers exert isn't new, the tools that they use are. Few in the technical community intentionally create technology to cause harm, but it is possible that there is a disconnect from the unintended effects of those creations. By finding ways of designing technology to thwart attempts at manipulating it for abuse right from the get-go, we should be able to produce products that improve the lives of some of society's most vulnerable people. Compassion should be our foundation always, and in today's world, this is more important than ever. Finally, if anyone is affected by what we've discussed today, there is support available to you. These include police response, online support, helplines, refuges, and other services. We've included some organisations here who can help, but other support services are available.
So Lesley, thank you for introducing us to your work at IBM and the various policies that have been introduced to provide safer technology to tackle domestic abuse. The next topic on the agenda is the panel session that you all have been waiting for. So as the panel gets ready, I'd like you to answer 3 quick poll questions. With that, let me start with the panel discussion. And the first question is to Corbin. So what lessons have we learned about technology and intimate partner violence during the pandemic?
That's a very big question. During the pandemic, we've seen an increase across every type of tech abuse. A lot of people's lives shifted much more online than they already were before. It's not true for everybody, but and then also being isolated, stuck at home with their abusers. And so, harassment, limiting access to technology, surveillance, impersonation, we saw all of those rise. And of course, because so many were, much more limited in their movement, abusers had more access to survivors' devices, to their accounts, and it has been harder for victims to get the privacy they need, so that they can connect with help. And in situations like that, it's essential to have alternative options at local victim service programs besides phone lines to be able to communicate. And local victim service programs across the country and around the world did an amazing job at switching from an in-person support service to virtual assistance. And it was incredible to see all of the creative ways domestic and sexual violence programs created these new virtual doors for survivors, many of them overnight, to be able to connect with them so they could support them in getting the assistance they needed to increase their safety. And I think as far as lessons learned, as we slowly move towards a time where we might soon think of life as post-pandemic life, we encourage those who did such a tremendous job of keeping services accessible remotely to build in time to pause and assess, because it had to happen really rapidly. And so folks need to pause and look at what worked well. How did having virtual services open access up to community members who may not have been able to access those services before? I think there's a huge benefit to virtual services for folks who may live far from the program or who don't feel comfortable showing up or don't have transportation or at home taking care of kids. Being able to access help remotely is really important. And then looking at how can we make sure we're prioritizing privacy in those services that we're providing, and that we're using tools that prioritize privacy. We live in a culture where by default, many tech companies have access to the private information that's stored in and exchanged on their platforms. But we're also seeing more and more companies begin to really work to prioritize privacy and develop tools that consider the intimate partner violence threat model. In addition to the other threat models they're looking at when they're looking at security and in all the good ways Lesley mentioned in her presentation. So yeah, I think that's what I'd bring to that question.
Dana, perhaps you'd like to add to it?
I think Corbin summed it up very well. I would just say that we saw a lot of different types of technology abuse that we hadn't seen before working with survivors. Some of the things that we saw is, since we're focusing a lot on children tonight, is abusers trying to surveil locations through things like Google Classroom, hearing a lot more about smart devices such as televisions, voice assistants, and a lot of that probably because people are in their homes a lot more. And so just being very cognizant of all the different ways that this type of surveillance is occurring, and I think continuing to provide remote resources when this time period is over so that we can provide more services to people.
Any other thoughts? Yes, Eva.
Just one quick thing, which is one of the other side effects of quarantine that we have seen is that people have shifted to, students have shifted to remote learning, and people have shifted to remote work. And some of the apps that we have seen associated with these shifts are extremely intrusive. That includes proctoring software, which is sometimes very intrusive and also doesn't work correctly, and what we call bossware, which is software which is marketed for employers to require people to install on their personal machines at home that monitor their productivity in extremely invasive ways, moment by moment, often even going so far as to track users' attention. For example, if you are to look away from the screen for a moment, this is registered as you're not paying attention and therefore you're not being productive. And we see the same thing in schools. And these apps, in addition to being extremely invasive, also get abused. I mean, their use all by itself is bad enough. But in addition to that, we see other students abusing these apps. We see teachers abusing these apps. We see parents abusing these apps, abusive partners, exes, all kinds of stuff. And that is probably the biggest and most frightening trend that I have seen as a result of COVID-19 and quarantine.
So let's move to the next topic. So what are some unique ways you have heard about how survivors are using technology to stay safe during the pandemic? Corbin, would you like to start with that?
Sure, I can jump in. Of course, we don't do a lot of direct work with survivors. We work with advocates who are working with survivors. So I definitely want to make space for others. I think, a few of the things that we've heard about are similar to strategies survivors have used when there wasn't a pandemic. Timing their outreach to help based on their abuser's schedule. That became a little more difficult, a little more complicated in some circumstances. If the abuser used to go to work in an office and then was able to start working at home virtually, that meant more time. And so being able to get out of the house became more complicated, to get private time more complicated. So folks started using outings to be able to reach out and connect, taking a walk around the neighborhood, scheduling, maybe a play date with other kids, and then using the device of the children's other parents to be able to reach out. Using messaging. Of course, messaging apps are quiet, right? You don't have to, you can't be overheard. So if the device felt safe enough, or if the person just needed to reach out and didn't, sometimes folks know spyware is on a device and need to reach out anyways, and so they do it, and they take that risk. But we also saw, the creative use of, like, instead of using regular chat tools like WhatsApp or instant messaging or text, like going into online games, and starting a game up with a friend and asking for friends to help, through that chat, through that online game chat, because it's less likely that if somebody's coming and picking up their device at home, that they're going to go to the online Scrabble game, right? That's not, they might go through messages on text, but these online games might provide a different method. I'd love to hear from other folks on the panel as well.
I've definitely seen people chat over games. That is a really common sort of place for people to hide. And also, it's been more important than ever for people to be able to reach out in order to maintain their support networks, because being isolated and quarantined with your abuser is nightmarish, and it isolates the survivor from reality, which is really disorienting. And that is the time when they need this sort of support the most.
And to all attendees, do please use the Q&A chat for your questions. We have some time to take your questions. So let's move to the next. So what can survivors do to help protect themselves when they have tech abuse concerns? Diana?
Sure. So I'm going to look at this question from the perspective of it's difficult to sometimes connect with organizations that provide help. So there are things that survivors can do who have tech concerns. Tonight we talked a little bit about two-factor authentication and setting up safe accounts, but one of the things that we sometimes suggest is really trying to do an assessment of all the accounts that people have as a very beginning. So just like making a list of everything from banking to smart devices to Netflix, to any way you have been connected, looking at all the emails that you have and all the passwords that you have. And if there are concerns, just looking at who's had access to those accounts, who set them up, and thinking about, if it is safe to do so, how to start separating out those accounts. And within that framework, looking at what the recovery accounts are set to, and what other permissions you might be sharing, looking at, location and other things. And I recognize when I say this, it's a huge undertaking to do. I have some resources that I've created that I give out, which is like a simple form called Tech Disconnect that can help guide people through it. And I'm happy to provide that resource. But I think that that's like a very good way. And then also a lot of the companies have everyday resources that you can use. There's like recent logins in Google that you can see logins 28 days back. And so like looking at some of the resources that are already available out there. And again, understanding it's not easy to navigate some of these things, but that's how I think of a way to start.
Any other thoughts?
I'd say regarding the use of what you were talking about, tips for people who work with survivors but don't necessarily feel familiar with technology. A lot of the folks that we go in and train feel that way, and one of the things I always say is that more than you think you do. To be sitting across from a survivor who is struggling to find employment, you don't necessarily need to know how to get every job that ever was. You don't have to know the specific details of the kind of job that they want to get, right? But you can help them skill build. And there's such a wealth of information online that, we often will get questions around, my account's been taken over, somebody's created a fake account for me, or I want to collect evidence to hold this person accountable. How do I do that? And very often what I do is I go to the help centers of those social media companies, and they lay out in great detail, in very easy to understand language, how to handle those situations. I think they've done a tremendous job, in response to and in partnership with the domestic violence organizations and sexual violence organizations they've worked with. So there's a wealth of information out there. I reach out to us at SafetyNet and NNEDV.org. We provide technical assistance. We're happy to help. We've got a lot of resources on our website that we've plugged. But I'd just say, there's no formula, right? It's the same skills that you use in non-tech based things. What's their goal? What tools are least risky for them to use? Think through, have you given them information they need to be able to make an informed decision? If you're going to use text messaging or instant messaging with them, have you talked with them about some of those risks? And remembering, I think at the core, remembering that there's no cookie cutter response. What's safe for one person can be very dangerous for another person. And what's safe for me today may be incredibly dangerous for me tomorrow, right? It's always shifting, it's always moving. And so keeping conversations going, checking in are all really important skills. And those are skills I think that folks working with victims have in many other capacities. So it's kind of taking that and applying it to tech.
Okay. Thanks, Corbin. So let's take a question on regulations. So what cybersecurity regulations have been passed for threats to individuals from technology? And what are the challenges being faced towards enacting these regulations? Perhaps Eva could start with that question.
This is often when I spend time talking about tech-enabled abuse, and I talk about stalkerware or bossware or proctoring software or anything like that, the first response that I get is there ought to be a law. We should make that stuff illegal. And this is the worst answer. This is both the worst and the most obvious and the least helpful answer that I can think of. And the reason for that is because frequently the software that is enabling this sort of abuse is not solely used for abuse. It is dual use technology. And so what are you going to do? Ban messaging? Harassment is already illegal. And I think that if you want to address the fact that tech-enabled harassment often goes unpunished, then the problem is with our legal system and with our law enforcement system, and not that we need more laws. We need to enforce the laws that already exist. One of the things that a lot of sort of organizations in this space have done in order to sort of facilitate this sort of thing has been building systems that allow people to document the abuse, to have all of the abuse in one place, to take the appropriate screenshots, for the screenshots to have timestamps on them, so that you can so that you can present them all to law enforcement at once. And sometimes that is helpful. But I think that another very useful avenue sort of to move forward is also outreach to law enforcement. Because right now, if you are a victim of tech-enabled abuse and you come with your folder full of screenshots to your local law enforcement, it's a crapshoot whether or not you actually end up with someone who even understands what you're saying, or who understands the kind of abuse that you are describing, much less knows what to do about it, knows how to investigate it, and can present it to the DA. So I think that we have a very, very long way to go, and none of the ways forward involve making new laws.
Any other panelists like to add to it?
On a policy level, one of the things that we're working on in New York right now is allowing survivors to get removed from family phone plans. And so that's something that, yeah, because that's an important problem. A lot of times survivors are being surveilled through family phone plans, and people could have access to location as well as numbers recently called. We're also working on having hotlines not appear on the phone bill. And some of the ways like designing those policies get very complicated in the respect that we're trying to give survivors a reasonable amount of time before the abuser would know that they are being removed from the phone plan. So there are like different types of ways. And then also a lot of the people search sites and data brokers that are out there, I think, addressing that through better policies and protections, because it is challenging to get one's information removed from that and navigating that system. So that's something else we're working on in New York. But I think that these things deserve a lot of attention as well.
Yes, no, this is great. And so Bindu has been waiting patiently. Let's have a question for her. So Bindu, how is Narika seeing a spike in domestic violence cases during the pandemic? And perhaps you could also suggest how people could support Narika and its movement.
Sure. So I'm sure, as we all know, last year has kind of been a difficult year for us. And we've, of course, seen a lot of increase in mental health issues, financial and housing instability, increased parenting responsibilities at home. So that's just been across the board. And when the shelter in place started, Narika saw a 3-time increase or a 3-fold increase in cases of domestic violence to our helpline. Alongside with technology abuse, there was increased brutality, violence and abuse at home. Of course, there was a lot of financial stressors that played a role. There's increased parental responsibilities, increased substance and alcohol use, etc. What we did see was a lot of blatant violations of court orders, child custody decisions due to the court slowing down due to COVID as well. Of course, many of us survivors of domestic violence have also lost their employment. Again, very symbolic of really what our communities are facing, but also that our survivors of domestic violence who are facing this loss in unemployment and were looking for support to re-enter the workforce, etc. Those fleeing abuse became housing and food insecure and were reaching out for things like food and essentials, etc. We've also observed, I think Corbin shared this, that survivors of domestic violence are using alternate means of communications other than the phone to reach out for support. And also the demographics of those reaching out for us are continuing to evolve and expand over the last year. In terms of how people can support, I would say volunteering with a local nonprofit, especially one that focuses on domestic violence, like Narika, is a wonderful first step. Volunteer your expertise, your time, and your voice to local nonprofits in your area. Narika has a virtual counselor training that is starting on April 17th, and you can learn more about domestic violence or how to support your friends and peers if they're experiencing violence. Another option is always to make a donation to a local domestic violence nonprofit in your area or to Narika. Nonprofits that do critical work like this cannot do this for free forever without the generous support of communities like every single one of us here. So donations of any amount will help us continue doing critical work like this. And I would say the third one is really actively learn about relationship abuse and domestic violence. The stats are insane. 1 in 3 women in the US will experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner or by someone they know, which means that 1 in 3 of us in this webinar know someone or has experienced abuse. And so this might be your children, your peers, your neighbor. This might be you. And so recognizing that really no one is exempt and also that domestic violence disproportionately affects women. So I would also just say that we need to recognize domestic violence and its various forms of coercion. Technology is something we talked about, but also financial abuse, immigration-based abuse. And the good news really in all this is that we all have a role to play in ending violence and abuse at home. And it starts with each one of us.
Thanks, Bindu. So I know there's a fair amount of questions in the Q&A, and Corbin is already answering some of them.
One of the questions that came up, someone said, before watching this webinar, I was unaware of the different ways technology could be used to facilitate abuse. Do you think that the prevalence of these behaviors are related to how serious society takes them? And I think that would be a great question to kind of hear from folks on the panel, what your responses are. You know, technology, the way that we talk about it, technology is one tool among many that abusive partners misuse against survivors. Just because you get rid of the technology does not mean the abuse ends. And so that kind of, to that earlier point I made about, you know, getting rid of technology is not the answer. That's one of the many reasons. But I do think it absolutely reflects the broader culture and how it responds to intimate partner violence. And much of the best work that's done in this movement, I think, is done around prevention and around changing societal norms and cultural norms about what is acceptable, what makes a healthy relationship, how people can communicate, you know, and starting, you know, we were talking about kids, right? Starting at a young age and talking to everyone about it. Not just people who we think are at risk, but everybody, because we all grow up to be adults, right? And we all grow up to enact certain behaviors. So I'll pass it on to the rest of the panel if anyone else is interested in talking about that.
I mean,
I'll jump in.
I'll go for it.
I really will piggyback on what Eva and Corbin have just said, and also Bindu, everyone. I agree with everything that's been said. But this is why we're having this conversation right now in Australia about this idea of coercive control, because despite such high levels of awareness of domestic violence, which especially Australia, the UK, the US, where most of our participants and attendees are located today, there's a very high level of awareness of domestic violence, but sort of this precious little actual understanding. And it's not rocket science. Abusers are mostly not rocket scientists. And they share a common playbook of abusive behaviors and tactics that do go unresponded to and unchallenged because they are, in fact, extensions of mainstream cultural norms around relationships and gender and what all of that looks like. So we absolutely have to have those difficult conversations. There's no magic app or device that can fix domestic violence. I see these calls going around where people are trying to invent them, and I just think, good luck. We really have to talk about what healthy relationships look like, what we want our own relationships to look like. And, nowadays this includes privacy and tech. Do you have access to your partner's phones and devices? Under what circumstances? And one of the things that I really think is important is in the research area, we're seeing a lot of the mistakes of bad research on domestic violence being translated into the tech space. So there is literally no checklist, no list of behaviors that you can use to say this is abuse or this is not abuse. Every behavior, from giving someone flowers to murdering another person, can be used to exert coercion and control or to protect others and survive abuse. So you cannot use a checklist. And so in the research space, we have some intimate partner violence research, mostly with university students, that is replicating these mistakes. And I think we're getting some really misleading findings in the research that makes it look like online abuse is not gendered, for example, that it is ubiquitous. So we need to be really careful.
Thank you, Molly. And we are just running out of time as well, but it's a great way to end this session. And we have obviously have a lot of these questions captured. We'll try to answer these questions offline and share these charts with you. But thank you very much for participating in today's webinar and panel discussion. We appreciate you all being here. Thanks also to our panelists, Molly Dragiewicz, Eva Galperin, Dan Freed, Corbin Streett, Lesley Nuttall, and Bindu Oomen Fernandes for sharing their insights and expertise. I think we all have a much better appreciation for how technology is being used for domestic abuse and how we as a community need to work together to find solutions that result in safer communities. We hope you found this session and dialogue valuable. Let us all strive to create a world free of digital abuse. You will receive a note on how you can stay engaged with the webinar series. I encourage you to volunteer and donate to Narika in order for us to assist the DV survivors. You will all receive a survey asking for feedback on this event. Your insights will help us to shape future events. On behalf of Narika, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.